Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and I am joined today by the wonderful Deva Green. Hello, Deva.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
It's a pleasure, and you are back because, hey, look what I've spotted. Aha, the moon and its nodes in evolutionary astrology. So I've been having a read and enjoying myself very much with it. And I thought maybe it would be a good place to start by actually talking about the role of the moon in evolutionary astrology, because people are very familiar with the idea that the nodes are linked with the soul. So where does the moon fit in?
Oh, that's a great starting point. And the moon, from an evolutionary astrology perspective, fits in terms of the current emotional structure or self-image that the soul creates so that it can emotionally integrate and navigate through transition from our past to future. So it's like the emotional body or the emotional structure that the soul creates to support ourselves through transitioning from older habits from the past, so to speak.
So that might surprise people because when we're talking about self-image, naturally people are used to looking at the ascendant and the ego as being the sun. So here we're talking about the moon in that context, but it's very specifically an emotional context.
That's right. It's where we'll be feeling the pull towards shifting older security patterns that connect to our past as we move towards our future, and how we can support ourselves or nurture ourselves through that transition. So, from my understanding, it is an emotional component, or how we'll be working with that on a day-to-day basis.
I think that's quite interesting for lots of different reasons, and I'm just wanting to pick one of them. um, because if we think about what it is that is the core of us, it is our emotional self. And so that kind of shifts perspective a little bit, where we might think about the sun as something we're growing into, as we know that we're growing into it. Perhaps there's more of a something in common with the North Node in that respect, because it's something that's evolving, as well as self-expression. Whereas the moon is everything, because putting on my therapist's hat, emotion is everything. It drives everything. Our subconscious is made up of our emotion. So that's a very interesting way to look at this.
Yes, and right, to speak to what you're bringing up, that it's my understanding that evolution or personal growth takes place through the emotional body, and that working with our emotions in that way, that we can support healthier habits or support our own growth by embracing ourselves as emotional beings in that regard.
It might surprise people to be thinking of the moon as being linked with the present, because we're used to linking the moon with the past.
Right, that's a great point. From my understanding, in terms of the evolutionary paradigm, that the reason that the moon is present or current self-image or emotional structure is that it's linked to the south node and north node, and that the south node then is our past or a prior life emotional structure, and the north node then is our growing or evolving self-image or emotional structure. So the natal moon then is the present, and supports again that shift from our self-image of the past, how we've emotionally secured ourselves relative to past emotional patterns, and being that bridge in terms of the present to the North Node, how we can, what we're growing, or the self image that we're developing or growing into, so to speak, to facilitate or to promote our personal growth into the future. So, in terms of present, that natal moon is again going to be how we're sitting with that in the current moment or in the present, so to speak.
I'm just thinking about that because it makes sense from the point of view that the way our emotions are our emotions, and they're very much linked, as we've already said, with our identity or the core of who we are. And that does remain constant. We might learn how to handle our emotions differently, and we might hopefully do some inner work to help us heal wounds that are there from our childhood, which of course are reflected very much in the moon and the ascendant and the first house, etc. And it's that work around the moon stuff that actually helps us shift forwards, isn't it? So thinking about it, it makes sense, doesn't it?
Oh, it very much resonated with me, and has been something that, yes, makes sense, and that I have found helpful for me in my personal growth, is to orientate towards it in that way.
So would you be able to give us a little snippet of the different moon signs as they express something about our evolution?
Oh, great! Yeah. From my understanding, let's take somebody with a moon in the sign of Libra, and that how that can be supporting them along, where the emotional structure then will be based on initiating relationships with others, equality, balance, looking for equal footing in relationships, and that there can be a symbol of emotional extremes, and how that can be supporting, or how that a moon in Libra can be emotionally nurturing, or supporting themselves through that shift that we were talking about, is balancing the need to give and also the balancing the need to receive. That oftentimes with the moon in Libra, there's an imbalance or there's an inequality, and that will deeply affect the emotional body. And then there can be an not an over, but there can be a hypersensitivity to when things are out of balance. So, from my understanding, a way that a moon in Libra in a general sense could support themselves is really always emotionally integrating around balance, equality, and equal giving and receiving.
And issues around rejection as well, because that that moon in Libra, Libra wants love, wants to be loved, and so
Yes.
that I'll do anything for love. So that's the whole motto: I'll do anything for love. And that's what creates the imbalance, because then there's an incongruity that develops in relationship. And so it's understanding that, well, sometimes you're not going to be popular all the time. And
Oh, exactly.
yeah, so okay, well, that's, and you're talking about that balance, and or the need for balance as being the impulse for evolution. But that brings me to another question then. because let's say fire and water have feelings covered. It's their emotional elements. They might express emotion differently, but it's all about emotion that drives the passion of fire and the sensitivity, vulnerability of water. But when we've got the moon in earth or air, and we're talking about the moon representing the core of our emotional self, and we've got two elements here that are not known for being comfortable with feeling. What do we say about that?
Yes, that's in terms of the moon, whereas a moon in Libra, the need to be needed can create, as you were saying, can create that imbalance or is a core component of that emotional body. And seeing that if there's a moon sign in earth or air, let's say, for example, if the moon sign, let's take the polarity of Cancer Capricorn, how a moon in Capricorn can potentially emotionally secure themselves via the earth sign is through external security sources linked to the social career, the role in the world, social conditioning. So it's almost like the water element of the moon, in terms of an earth sign, is being structured through uh, the earth element, or it can be structured through what's coming through, let's say, again, society, if the moon is in Capricorn, if the moon were in Taurus, it could be coming through materials, depending on the context or evolutionary state. So it's like that water is being molded or shaped through earth, and that's what's providing emotional stability.
It's interesting because perhaps what we're saying then is that with earth and air, it can be a little bit trickier because we're looking externally for that emotional security, be it through the earth tangibles or through water and through air connection, the connection with others. And actually, we need to be finding a way to create that emotional security, which brings me back to needing to help those two elements be comfortable with that.
Right, what you're speaking to, in my point of view, is the core of the fourth house moon Cancer archetype, which is internalizing emotional security. And that through the sign of, or through the air or earth signs, that the component of water or nurturing, let's say through a moon in Capricorn in specific, could be supporting the growth towards developing one's own voice of authority that's outside of a position or career or society, and that's coming internally, so that shift from external to internal can be supported. And let's say through air signs with connections, in a general sense, this is just coming to mind, so it's general, but moon in Aquarius, let's say that they've had a lot of social acquaintances, been involved in a lot of group dynamics, and that emotional security is then linked with those associations, as you were sharing. So that secret of internalizing emotional security will come through at times if the moon's in Aquarius, emotionally disengaging from friendships that are no longer serve or are no longer of like mind, to support internalization of emotionally nurturing that need for connection from within first, and then from that, the right groupings, the right social context for them, or the right peer, the right group, so to speak, that can come from that emotional shift of doing that from the inside out, so to speak.
It makes sense because ultimately our feelings must be our own. And we need to understand what those feelings are. And I spend a good deal of time as a therapist helping people to understand how they do feel about things, because very often they're simply reflecting other people's feelings and not their own.
Oh,
Water and fire seem to have an easier time of that because they feel what they feel. And that's they feel what they feel. So what would the challenge be for them? Because here we've got lots of feeling, but maybe it's too much.
right. Let's say, for example, with the moon and Sag, that fire around what they believe, what their personal truth is, their personal philosophy, or their personal vision, and those emotions are, as you say, are so their own, or they're so strong in them that it can kind of become overgeneralized, or can become very exaggerated, and can be a bit strong for others around. And the challenge then, from my perspective, is nurturing oneself also into securing oneself through that belief or truth in such a way where it doesn't have to become other people's. So I guess from what you're sharing, that truth or that emotion doesn't have to specifically be shared by others for the soul to be secure.
So ultimately, it comes back to how do we cultivate this sense of security?
Yes.
So, where there is an overemphasis on emotion, that's often an overreaction or an. So we're talking about, if we're talking about the pitfalls for the elements, and we're saying that the pitfall for air and earth is an over reliance on external factors for security, and a kind of almost a disconnection from feeling, then from their own feelings, then what we're talking about with fire and water is potential for overreaction and also overcompensation, and coming back to feeling heard and feeling seen in those feelings, or actually realizing that ultimately, whether we're heard or seen doesn't really matter. We do feel what we feel. And to be able to give that back to ourselves and say, well, I see myself, I hear myself. And that's enough for the time being.
Oh, exactly right. Let's say, for example, or from what I've learned, to what you've been sharing, that going back to Moon and Libra and how they can secure themselves is, let's say, if the giving isn't being reciprocated, and that it's being that emotional security is then linked with either the need to be needed, and the imbalance, giving to oneself, or saying, that's okay if what I'm giving isn't being received by the other, because I can nurture myself through also giving to myself, or creating that inner sense of equality and balance, and then going into relationships from there. So it's like a way of saying I can secure myself internally instead of externally, if that makes sense.
And this, of course, all becomes important for the growth of the sense of who we are. And put it a different way, in evolutionary astrology terms, the growth of the soul.
Yes, exactly. That, from my perspective, or from what I've learned, supports or nurtures the transition from older or outdated security patterns, so that we can personally grow. So it facilitates our growth towards who we feel we're becoming.
So this sounds very simple. We're only looking at the moon in the signs. However, it's often not so simple. It's very, very handy if the moon happens to be in a trine or a trine sextile relationship with the nodes. But what if it's conjunct either the north or the south nodes? How would you begin to understand what that is representing?
Oh, that's a great question. And in a general sense, from my understanding, if the moon is conjunct the south node, that emotional security dynamics, the self-image, how the soul is securing itself is linked to the soul's past, or then is linked to or being most likely relived relative to the placement of the south node. And that by that house and sign on the south node, that you can gain a, di- a deeper insight into what those security patterns would be, and that the soul is reliving those, or most likely redoing those in this lifetime uh, um, to release itself from outdated security patterns of the past. And at times it's a rare condition, but at times it can also symbolize that the soul is bringing something to an absolute fruition point, or that it's something that the soul is bringing to a completion or culmination point. And it can also be expressed as a little of column A and a little of column B, that you're reliving some things and also bringing some things to future. So the soul's past then is connected to, or the south node then, and older security patterns are linked to the soul's present self-image, and either in a state of fruition or relive, or both.
And what happens when we have a square situation where the moon is squaring the nodes?
Oh, it's a great question. And from my understanding, it's a skip step that the soul will be needing to recover or resolve an area where it's been flip-flopping or going between the two nodes relative to the archetype of the moon, or what we've been discussing in terms of the emotional security patterns, the present self-image, and how the soul will then go about supporting itself through transition from past to future.
Two questions. I'm trying to decide which one to go with first. Okay, so I'll go with this one. So that's the moon in relation to the nodes. But I'm sure you've seen many charts where there is a stellium around that south node. And it's interesting because there's just, it feels like the chart is out of balance. It's pulling back into that past. What do you feel about that?
Oh, when there's a stellium on the south node?
Yes.
Yeah, that the emotional dynamic is to revisit or to repeat dynamics of the past, so that a potential fruition can come. And so it creates an emotional need to focus more intently on dynamics of the past in order for a potential reliving to happen. So yeah, it may feel like an intense pull, or that it highlights the need to really reflect upon the past in certain cases.
So then what we're saying is that we can look at this as past south node, north node future, and the moon is the present. And that the dynamic relationships that are set up through the aspects in the chart are going to indicate the degree to which we're going to, or the emphasis, where the emphasis lies. So if there is a strong emphasis on the South Node, then there is maybe a cleanup operation that's required before we can move forward. Does that mean then that the soul's progress is being slowed down? Or perhaps, I don't mean that in a sense of it being a regressive movement, but more like a slow motion effect, where we're having to go over past life patterns in great detail with a magnifying glass, to make sure that we're taking as much from that experience as we can in order to move forward.
From my understanding, that's right, that more time can be needed for that magnifying glass for to be released from those conditions, or for movement for the future to happen. So yes, it can take more time. As you were saying, not as regression, but in order for that release to happen, so to speak, and the requirement of the magnifying glass, absolutely.
It is the case that working as a past life regressionist, there do seem to be people who have patterns that just keep repeating one life into the other. And it feels like some sort of reincarnation Groundhog Day, where things just keep happening in the same way. And I think it feels almost like you're coming at the same issue from lots of different angles. So it's not necessarily that you didn't get it right the first time and you have to resit the exam. It's more a case of, okay, you've learned a lot from this perspective. Now let's replay that from this perspective, and then this perspective, and another perspective. And I think that sometimes I can see that often I can see that in charts as well, where yes, you've learned everything you could in one lifetime about the sign of Aries, which is on your South Node. But here, when you're coming back now with the Sun in Aries, so yes, there is this need to develop Libra, but you haven't finished with Aries yet. And actually there's something there that's really important, because if you forget that there is integrity in the person themselves, you are going to be out of balance with Libra, because you're just going to be worrying about pleasing everybody else. Does that make sense to you?
Right. It's like taking the taking the gold, or taking what's been learned in its best sense from that South Node to the future, so that it's not something forgotten, but rather that something that helps maintain a sense of security and overall balance relative to the North Node. So it does. And what comes to mind in a general sense is, at times, planets on the South Node in general, the soul can reap the rewards for prior efforts made. So taking that with you, or taking efforts that the soul has deeply driven into from the past, and taking those with.
There's so much that's beautiful about this, but I think for me the bit that sticks in my mind is that every sign has its weaknesses, but every sign has its beauty. And this is what we're talking about here, isn't it? is to take what's beautiful from each experience that we have over many lifetimes, and then refine it, polish it, build on it. And of course, we do that through polarity, because it's the polarity that informs us. It's by looking at the opposite that we begin to get definition for the other.
That's right, through the polarity point, and in a way to where we never lose what was good, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah, I like that very, very much. So, okay, we've been talking about the nodes and the moon, and yet we know that Pluto also plays a very important part. So I think it would be somewhat negligent not to bring Pluto into the mix. So now we've got the three, past, present, and future. Where's Pluto coming in?
Yes, right. That Pluto, from an evolutionary astrology paradigm, always is the starting point within the birth chart. It correlates to the soul, and where the soul will naturally pick up relative to past lifetimes, or where it will naturally come in with. And from my understanding, in the vast majority of us, the soul becomes conscious over different lifetimes, but it also reflects unconsciousness, or areas that are unconscious, while the moon symbolizes conscious, how we can work with the process that's happening from Pluto, or that's happening from the soul in a conscious way. That's my understanding. So while Pluto can be our unconscious drives, or places where we operate where we're not fully aware, the moon is our subjective, or our conscious emotional security. And so it's that interfacement between how we can integrate, or how we can support movement towards what's unknown in a conscious way, if that makes sense.
Whilst you were speaking and I was listening to you as you described the various functions, I had this image of the moon being a great lab or a kitchen, where the various ingredients brought in from Pluto and the South Node are brought in, and something is created with them in the present, so that we could then move forward. Maybe I'm thinking of maybe it's alchemical imagery that's coming to my mind. I thought of it as a kitchen or a lab, but actually maybe it is a lab, because it's like an alchemical process where we are having to bring in these various components and then turn them into something. Well, yes, and as we know, labs can be prone to explosions, and moon square Pluto comes to mind, you know.
That's right. That with the emotional body, or with being the lab, that we can create its own either malfunctions or explosions. And we go into the lab until we figure out just the right component, or until we find out just the right ingredients to make it work.
Well, all of this, of course, just fills me with tremendous compassion and admiration for the whole of humanity, because don't we come in with a lot on our plates?
Oh, yes.
Well, Deva, I think if people want to learn more about evolutionary astrology, and particularly with regards to the moon and the nodes, your book is a fabulous place to go. So I'll be putting a link to it in the description box. And how do people find you?
Oh, I wanted to thank you so much for recommending the book. I really appreciate it. And in terms of how to get a hold of me, can contact me through my email, devagreen@fastmail.fm, or my website, www.devagreen.com.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'll be putting a link to that in the description box, along with the link, so that people can find the book easily. Deva, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you as well. It's been wonderful to be back.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at the mind-body connection as reflected through the chart. Until then, goodbye.